Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us today. My name is Tarek Masoud. I am the director of the Middle East Initiative at the Harvard Kennedy School and the Sultan of Oman Professor of International Relations here. And it's my great honor, along with my colleague, Professor Matt Bunn, to welcome you to today's event with Mohammed Alyahya, who is the editor-in-chief of Arabiya English, which is the digital English service of Arabiya Network, which is described as the largest pan-Arab free-to-air regional news network. And Mohammed is going to talk to us today about Iran. As some of you know, we have been deeply interested in Iran and its engagement with the rest of the world and with its region in particular for the past several years. And here at the Kennedy School, we've convened events with several speakers to explore this. Most recently, we had Professor Javad Salahi Isfahani of Virginia Tech University talk to us about how Iran's domestic economic situation is being impacted by the dual shock of COVID-19 and low oil prices. And sort of continuing in that vein, we have with us today Mr. Alyahya. He is one of the most intelligent, articulate, strategically sophisticated people I've had the pleasure of meeting in a great number of years. In addition to being the editor-in-chief of Arabiya English, he's a senior research fellow at the Gulf Research Center. Prior to that, he used to be a fellow at the Atlantic Council and at the King Faisal Center for Research and Islamic Studies. He has published extremely widely, including for the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Telegraph, the Financial Times, Newsweek, the Guardian, etc. He's been all over television. He is a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania, which is something we don't hold against him, a native of Saudi Arabia. And he is one of those people who, when you encounter him, you feel extra bad about yourself, because once you realize how young he is and how much he's achieved and the level of gravitas he has managed to achieve in his life, you begin to wonder what you have been doing with your own life. So it's a wonderful thing for us to have Mohammed to talk to us about this extremely serious issue. And so the way we will run this webinar is as follows. Mohammed will speak, let's say, for about 25 minutes. About Iran and particularly the security situation and how he views it. And then what we will want to do is open it up for discussion. The way we will do that is I will call on people to raise their hands, and you can raise your hand using the function in Zoom, the raise hand function in Zoom. When you raise your hand, I will then call on you and unmute you so that you can ask your question directly of Mr. Alyahya. And so I'm hoping that we will that way be able to have a very good conversation and dialogue about this very important issue. Before turning it over to Mr. Alyahya, I do just want to recognize my co-host, Professor Matt Bunn, and see if he has any remarks before we head into the event. Sorry, Matt, you were muted.
I have nothing to add except thank you for chairing this session, and thank you for Mohammed for being willing to talk to us.
And one thing that Matt had noted to me before we began is just for everybody to know that the session is being recorded. So when you do come to ask your question, just know that the session is being recorded and will be disseminated through Harvard's online channels and maybe some others as well. So please keep that in mind. And with that, I will now turn it over to Mohammed Alyahya. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Tarek. Your introduction was far, far too kind. I aspire to be one quarter of what you just described. I'd like to start by talking about my experience doing track 2 discussions with Iran. Am I supposed to not see anyone, by the way?
Yeah.
I'd like to start by talking about my experience doing track 2 discussions with Iranian track 2 representatives. I've done about 8 of them, and they were across Europe. And they were very interesting experiences for me. I'd been studying the Saudi-Iranian relationship, the U.S.-Iranian relationship, U.S.-Gulf relationship for a while, but having that experience of being in the room with people that know the regime firsthand in Iran, that in some cases represent the regime to a large extent, and spending 2 days with them in a room with a neutral European patron / arbiter, taking notes in the back of the room and trying to guide a discussion left and right, I discovered some very interesting things, and that is, namely that there are many lenses through which to look at what is deemed the Iranian threat, and there are many frameworks through which to perceive Iran in general, and there is a very pronounced disparity between the lenses used in Western capitals and in the United States, even among more hawkish actors against Iran, and the lenses that are used in the region. It's almost like two different languages. The most frustrating of these track twos was me looking at two sides of the debate, literally arguing, in a very rowdy way, but in two different languages. Nobody understood what the other side is saying. They're using different tools. They're using different variables. So I found myself towards the end of these experiences acting somewhat like an opinionated translator, trying to break down what the crux of the discussion is on each side was. And that's why, after speaking with Professor Masoud, we decided to look a little bit at how these lenses through which Iran is viewed differ, these languages, so to speak, what are their characteristics, and how we might better bridge these different modes of looking at Iran. And that will require, first of all, I guess, unpacking them to the best of our ability. And second, I'll inject a little bit of my opinion on what I think is going on. First of all, I would say that there is a fundamental difference in what the quote-unquote Iranian threat perception is. If you look at the P5+1 and on a very basic level, the difference between how the P5+1 look at Iran and how the regional actors look at Iran can be made clearer in this example. Every single country that is within range of Iran's ballistic missiles, whether they're medium, long range, or short range, or Iran's militias, where they have significant presence, were not included in the nuclear deal negotiations. None of them. Saudi Arabia wasn't included. The rest of the Gulf countries weren't included. US allies like Israel weren't included. So this was a security agreement. Admittedly, it was a nuclear-focused security agreement, but it is one where those most at risk in terms of security from Iranian expansionism or Iranian aggression were not included in the discussions, but were included more or less as an afterthought in these discussions. And that takes us more towards how the Iranian threat is perceived in these circles. I remember during the days where the Iranian deal was being discussed and was all over the media before it was signed in Geneva, there was definitely an aspect in the advertising of the deal, whether it's by Ben Rhodes or by President Obama himself. A part of this advertising or marketing campaign for the deal had to do with bringing Iran out of the cold. I mean, this is verbatim. Some quotes by President Obama would say Iran would be something along the lines of a responsible state actor, come back in from the cold. This is the first stepping stone in order to create a more lasting peace. Of course, it's a limited deal, but there's more to come. That soon proved to be false. What we saw is that Iran stepped up its activities across the region. They doubled down on ethnic cleansing and genocide in Syria. They continued to weaken the central government in Iraq and create a failed state in one of the most oil-rich countries in the world, a failed state of unprecedented proportions there. They continued to double down on Hezbollah, expanded towards Venezuela. Their international drug trade was at its height. And I'd like to remind everyone that it was around that time when Project Cassandra, which was a U.S. State Department project, or State Department DOD project, that aimed to clamp down on Hezbollah's, it's a DEA project, not a project. It aimed to clamp down on Hezbollah's drug trade, just that aspect of Hezbollah's work. And former Obama officials testified before Congress saying that this was tamped down on. Tamped down on is the exact terminology that they used in order to improve the chances of the Iran nuclear deal, in order not to affect adversely the chances for a successful signing of the Iran nuclear deal. There's another example in Syria. Many point at Syria and say that the reason for U.S. inaction in Syria, to a large extent, was influenced by the Obama administration's almost tunnel vision on signing a deal in Geneva. I recommend a friend of mine, a book that a friend of mine wrote called The Iran Wars. Jay Solomon, who was the foreign correspondent of the Wall Street Journal, extensively talked about the relationship between the JCPOA negotiations and the Iran deal. The idea, the difference, the fundamental difference, I would say, is that 80%, the lens in the Gulf that views the Iranian threat is focused 80% on Iran's expansion in the region, its militias across the region. These are things that people experience on a daily basis, that affect people's lives in the region on a daily basis, whereas Iran's nuclear ambitions never really affected people on a daily basis. And that's the fundamental difference between the two. An example of that is in Lebanon. Once you visit Lebanon, before the war, it used to look like a very different place. The southern part of Beirut, Dahia, used to look like a very different place. Southern Beirut in its entirety indeed looked like a very different place. It was very difficult to walk down the street and differentiate between people in terms of their sect or religion. You wouldn't be able to tell if somebody walking down the street was a Sunni, a Christian, a Maronite, a Druze, or a Shia. People generally look the same. Socioeconomic statuses didn't really differ in a very pronounced way among different sects. Today, what's happening is that there is almost self-rule by Hezbollah among the Shia populations, especially in the south, maybe less in places like Baalbek al-Hermel, where there is still some degree of independence, if you will. Today, people dress differently. People speak Arabic. You can see people speaking Arabic with sort of an Iranian accent. Even the abayas that people wear, the covers that people wear, are not Arabic style ones, but ones that more resemble a chador. So there is a cultural difference in that country, which is a discussion on its own on the side. But there's also a socioeconomic difference between these areas and the other areas of Lebanon. The fact that Hezbollah, for political purposes, exercises this influence, of course, at the behest of the Iranians and under the control of the Iranians, of all of the Shia areas, disadvantage the Shias that are living in Lebanon. The same can be said really of those in Iraq and elsewhere in the region. So this is something that people see on a daily basis and think about on a daily basis in the region, much less than purely the nuclear aspect. So essentially, again, so if when I was in Washington during 2015 and 2016, while the Iran deal was being negotiated and directly after it was signed, I remember joining some panels on Yemen. And at that point in time, when one would mention that the Iranians were backing the Houthis in Yemen, people would laugh in the audience. And people would treat whoever said something like that like they're a tinfoil hat wearing conspiracy theorist. This is ridiculous. There's no evidence for this. When in fact, the Iranian relation with the Houthi movement and its predecessor movement, Shabab al-Mu'min, started in 1984. When that's a whole other argument. But I mean, it was a political intersection rather than a religious one. True, they are not 12ers. A lot of instant experts on Yemen came out and said that there could be no relationship between the Houthis and the Iranians because they are 12ers in Iran and they're not 12ers. The Zaydis in Yemen are not 12ers. True, that is true, but it was the Iranian revolutionary textbooks that gave a very rigid and well thought out worldview to be taught in schools and universities, etc. That was adopted by Hussein Badruddin al-Houthi and Mohammed Alyahya, the head of the predecessor movement, the Shabab movement. It was those very Iranian revolution textbooks that were taught, and they weren't religious textbooks. They weren't 12-er textbooks. But it was about this worldview and view towards the region. That takes us to our second point. during the negotiation for the JCPOA, there was an interview with President Obama in the Atlantic, where he urged actors in the region to share the region. And that takes us to the next point, which is the characterization of the conflict with Iran that took a very sharp turn during the JCPOA days. It was characterized as a 1,400-year-old irrational struggle between Saudi Arabia on one side and then the Iranians on the other side, and that the United States and other Western actors were a removed and isolated third party that never really had to involve themselves in the struggle, and that the best way to deal with it is to withdraw from the region and allow the people in the region to share it among themselves and find their own equilibrium. And this was a problematic characterization of what happened for various reasons. Chief among them was that it was completely false, but also that it served other purposes that we'll get to. Saudi Arabia, there is no real Iranian-Saudi Arabian struggle. If you were to go to Riyadh and ask people in Riyadh what is Saudi Arabia's main national security threat, invariably, you would hear that it is Iran. It is Iran's influence over the Houthis, and it's Iran's oversight of ballistic missiles being lobbed into Saudi Arabia by the Houthis. They would point to Hezbollah, they would point to the Hashd militias in Iraq. There would be a long list. That's a very easy answer to get in Riyadh. If you were to go to Iran and ask them what the biggest national security threat to Iran is, invariably, you would hear that it's either the United States or Israel or both. Nobody would tell you that the main threat to Iran is Saudi Arabia. In fact, Iran is not in Iraq to reclaim any influence from Saudi Arabia. It's not in Syria to reclaim any influence from Saudi Arabia. I would venture to say it's not even in Lebanon to reclaim any influence from Saudi Arabia. What Iran is trying to do in these places is reclaim influence from what it perceives, or not reclaim influence, to upend what it perceives as a US-led regional order. So this is primarily a problem between the United States and between Iran. And it started when the Iranian regime, or when the revolution took hostage hundreds of Americans in the US embassy in 1979. It's been that same problem forever. I remember highlighting this point in one of the Detractor discussions I was in, where I mentioned to one of the more vocal and well-connected Iranians that were in the room. And I said, what if Saudi Arabia severed its relations with Western countries tomorrow? What if Saudi Arabia were to cut off its relations with the United States and Europe and focus eastwards, let's say? Would that change the dynamic with Iran? And his response was exactly this. He said, 100%. We have no issue with Saudi Arabia, except for the fact that it is an agent of this Western US imperialism, and that's pretty much it. So again, I think one of the most damaging frameworks that was introduced into the public discourse on the Middle East conflict with Iran was that it was one where the United States or Western European countries can view themselves as a neutral and removed third party to an irrational struggle that pre-existed their influence in the Middle East. It didn't. This is not fundamentally a problem between Saudi Arabia and Iran. It is fundamentally a problem between the West and Iran. Whether the West wants to play a role in this is secondary to the fact that these are the parties that involved. And the Iranian objectives in its proxy building and in its escalation in the region is to upend what it perceives to be a Western-led regional order and the Western-dominated order. One where it views Saudi Arabia as a client of that order and not the priority target, as it were, in the conflict. So that's another problematic way that this conflict is viewed. Now I'll try to get back to more contemporary issues. What we've seen with the Trump administration is that there was a complete reversal of everything that President Obama achieved with Iran, whether for better or for worse. It was just a blanket reversal. Maximum pressure was applied on the Iranian regime. And there was a large degree of oversimplification in the Washington and US discourse on what Trump is doing. Again, Trump is a very polarizing figure. As neutral third-party watchers of US politics, we see that this is a large this is a very polarizing topic, and there's a lot of craziness going on in the media. But this media situation in the United States took a toll on more sober and effective discussions on what's happening with Iran in light of Trump's policies. What we're seeing right now is that the maximum pressure campaign is putting Iran in a corner and causing Iran to reroute resources. So essentially, the title of the talk says that lifting sanctions on Iran is the nuclear option. To answer that, or to explain that in short form, depriving Iran of the resources it needs to fund a bloated regional proxy network is an essential part of dealing with Iran. It's the cornerstone, it's the foundation of how one should deal with Iran if you ask actors in the Gulf. Iranian regime needs US dollars to fund dozens and dozens of militias in Iraq, many of which it exercises complete control over, and others over which it exercises considerable control. In Syria, it's got militias of Fatimiyun and Zainabiyun fighters, which are Shia fighters from Pakistan and Afghanistan. These fighters have literally flown or bussed into Syria from Iran or from Afghanistan and asked to fight alongside the forces of Bashar al-Assad and the Hezbollah forces, the Lebanese Hezbollah forces. In many cases, you find that these fighters turn up without any ability to be trained. So they're put into camps and resources are low, so they can't feed them. A lot of them starve to death because sending them back over to Iran or to Afghanistan is too costly, whether by bus or whether through airlines. In Lebanon, Hezbollah is suffering, and the stimulus packages that Iran used to send to Hezbollah periodically are much smaller or even eliminated as a result of these sanctions. So in order to fund this network, which Iran really has grown to unprecedented proportions after 2011, it needs US dollars. It can't do so with Iranian riyals. It can't do so with currency from any other Middle Eastern country. It needs cold, hard cash and the US kind. So the fact that it is deprived from access to that cash today is limiting its ability to exercise influence over these militias and putting it in a position where it really has to reroute its focus inwards, especially considering that there is unprecedented mass unrest in the country, probably second only to the revolution that removed the Shah from power in 1979. So in the region, limiting Iran's abilities to fund its regional proxy networks is the priority. And I must say, I think President Trump's maximum pressure campaign on Iran is working. It's not perfect, of course, but it is working by and large. I can't hear you. It's by and large working. If we recall how things happened in the region, I've got a list here of escalation. Yes, right here. So ships were sabotaged on May 12, 2019. On June 19, 2019, Iran shot down a U.S. military drone, said it was in Iranian territory. The U.S. Central Command said the claim was false. It was in international airspace. On July 19, the IRGC seized the British flag tanker Stina Impero. And that was 2 weeks after Britain detained an Iranian tanker of the Strait of Gibraltar. So after that, 2 Saudi Arabian oil facilities are attacked by 25 drones and cruise missiles, and I can get into how that attack happened. It's a very interesting technology that actually is very alarming for many actors in the region. And then in October, Shia militia allies attacked the U.S. embassy in Baghdad again after the United States attacked Kitab Hezbollah and killed several high-ranking members. But the point out of all this, I'm not going to go through the entire list, is that since the maximum pressure campaign was mounted on Iran, what we seem to see from the Iranian side was this commitment to incremental, rational, limited escalation that was meant to test the waters and to see where exactly the limits of the United States was. And the point of that escalation, I think, is to attach a cost to the United States maximum pressure campaign such that it becomes a little bit too risky, and then they can push the United States to lift sanctions or to make some concessions that are beneficial to the regime in Iran. The response by the Trump administration has been to ignore these sanctions. In fact, no. during some of these escalations, the response by the United States was to sanction the central bank, or sanction regime figures in the IRGC, or sanction people that have to do with Khamenei. Never did the United States give the Iranian regime what it sought to achieve as a result of these incremental escalations, which is an easing of sanctions or a backdoor. Although there were offers for talks that were rejected by Iran. Even when the attack came on Saudi Arabia, Saudi oil facilities, there was no response by the Saudis, and there was no response by the Americans. The Americans said, if the Saudis want me to respond, I'm more than ready to respond to these attacks. And I think this is emblematic of something very important. I think it's true that the Trump administration doesn't want war. And I think it's definitely true that regional actors like Saudi Arabia didn't want war. If you look at the discourse at that point in time in the United States, headlines would say things along the lines of the UAE and Saudi Arabia are trying to egg on Donald Trump to go to war on behalf of them. The Saudis want to fight the Iranians to the last soldier. This was all completely false. Regional actors, especially in the Gulf, the last thing that they would want is war. But there are two realities that can exist simultaneously, and this is what people have been missing in mainstream discourse in the US. You can be a total proponent of depriving the Iranian regime of the resources that it needs in order to wage war in Iraq, in Syria, in Yemen, in Lebanon, etc., while not being a proponent for US military intervention or the outbreak of conventional war that will inevitably be a huge blow to the economies and to the people of the region. These two realities can exist side by side, and if we accept that they can exist side by side, then suddenly the policies of the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, other countries in the region start to make much more sense. I remember one headline said, after the Coast Guard, the United Arab Emirates met with the Coast Guard in Iran. This was, continuation of periodic meetings that were dropped, I think, or cut off for a couple of years. The point was, the headlines used to say that, this is a departure, a Emirati departure from the Saudi position of escalating towards war. Again, there is no escalation towards war. Nobody wants war. A testament to that is the fact that Saudis did not respond when the attacks happened on the oil facilities. And going back to this incremental escalation, the point is that this strategy is one where pressuring Iran economically serves two purposes, and they are the same but they're different. First purpose is to pressure the Iranian regime to reconsider its policies and enact real change that's sustainable, that brings more peace to the region. The second is to simply deprive it of the resources that it needs to enact these policies. It's known that the Iranians will try to attach a cost to this, will try to sabotage this by creating fireworks in the region, by provoking the region. The smartest thing to do, and this is after speaking to officials from the United States and elsewhere, and this is something I agree with, I think, is to ignore these things. If they do not cross certain sacred red lines, just ignore it. There's going to be acting out, there's going to be lashing out, but there are already tangible results from depriving the Iranians of these resources that are seen across the region. What happened after the killing of Qassem Soleimani was very interesting. After the Trump administration chose to ignore every single incremental escalation, the Iranians went to the next logical step. And this is a discussion I had with several people in the policy community about a month before the killing of Qassem Soleimani. I said, the only logical next step for the Iranians is either to kill an American serviceman or an American, or to take hostage Americans, because attacking 5% of the world's oil supply is pushing it. If you get no response for that, then there's only so much you can do to escalate. And also, President Trump has a habit of putting his entire foreign policy up for everybody to see on Twitter. So he said on Twitter that the red line is to kill American servicemen, or to kill an American, or to harm Americans. So it was very clear to the Iranians, just by scrolling through Donald Trump's Twitter feed, to understand exactly what Donald Trump wants to avoid, what Donald Trump's reputation in the United States and internationally is attached to protecting U.S. citizens. And they did so. And the American response at that point in time was to take out the most important figure in the Iranian regime, the engine of Iran's regional proxy network, along with his main lieutenant, and symbolically take out that person outside Iranian soil, which I think is very important for many reasons. If the United States were to choose to attack Iran, the 52 targets or whatever they were that were inside Iran, I think that's something that would backfire. This is a discussion I had again with somebody in the policy community before then. If Iranians die as a result of that attack, there could be a rallying around the flag effect. The regime probably would care very little that Iranians died in the attack and would utilize such an attack for its own consumption. Attacking Iranian militiamen and warlords outside Iran, however, removes that risk. First of all, what is Qassem Soleimani doing outside Iran is a good question to ask. It's not an attack on Iran itself. It's an attack on Iran's regional proxy infrastructure. And it's an attack on Iranian lieutenants, all of whom have American blood on their hands and have the blood of innocent people in the Arab world on their hands. That, I think, caused a very big recalculation on the Iranian part. Any escalation by the United States has to actually cause harm to the ruling establishment in Iran for it to be able to cause them to recalculate and recalibrate their position. If it's a symbolic attack, what they do is they attack again, try to incrementally escalate in such a way that they attach a higher cost. But when the US retaliation means a huge obstacle and derailment, if you like, of their regional plans, that's when it makes a huge difference. And I'll just explain why this is important, why Qassem Soleimani is very important. Qassem Soleimani, okay, in order for a militia in the region to survive, it needs three things. It needs US dollars and equipment and guns. It needs an ideology. And it needs a leader who's both tactically capable and charismatic and able to lead. Qassem Soleimani was the facilitator of all of these three things, and he was two of them. He was the charismatic leader that knew the head of every single militia in the Levant, that knew the names of the sons and daughters of every single militia in the Levant. People used to view him as a father figure, whether it was within Hezbollah or within militias in Iraq or within militias in Syria. The power of that kind of soft power, that kind of charisma among these militias has a huge value that one cannot attach a price to. And it's going to be interesting to see how these militias, and this militia structure rather, would fare after the demise of Qassem Soleimani. And the other part is, of course, his tactical prowess. Qassem Soleimani was a very capable general in proxy building, quick proxy building, setting up the hierarchy, logistics. I mean, under the leadership of Qassem Soleimani, the Quds Force and the Revolutionary Guard brought proxy building and militia building and building meaningful horizontal relationships with other proxies, whether they're Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan or Hikmatyar. They brought this to an art. In fact, his lieutenant in this relationship with Al-Qaeda, Taliban, and Hikmatyar is now the head of the Revolutionary Guards, Qa'ani. But he does not have the same charisma that Qassem Soleimani has based on what we are hearing and reading. And also, he doesn't have the connections that Qassem Soleimani has in the level. So there is definitely the killing of Qassem Soleimani and Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis. Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis is a force in his own right. The killing of these two people as a response to the targeting of an American really threw off the engine of Iran's regional proxy. It will take time to recover, especially in the absence of US dollars. So if you have a regional militia proxy militia network and there's no money, at the end of the day, headband wearing zealous Shia militia fighters have kids to feed. They've got hospital bills to pay. They can go for a month, 2 months, 3 months without being paid in the US dollar. But once that starts to drag on, and once ammunition starts to dry up, adding to that the loss of somebody that was considered, the average fighter's idols, that's a huge blow to a regional proxy network that incurred massive damage on the region. So I think I'll stop here and let Professor Tarek ask some more questions. But that essentially, I think, covers the differences in how the region is viewed.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mohammed, for a really excellent set of opening remarks that I think put a lot of important issues on the table that I'm hoping that we will dig into. You know, the premise of the talk is that there's a particular way in which Iran's neighbors view that country, and then there's a completely discordant way in which the United States views that country that is, in your view, at odds with the facts. And you laid out a quite impressive litany of facts that need to be taken into account. What I find interesting, and I would love to get you to comment on, is the fact that this kind of discordant view towards Iran exists within the United States, right? So as you alluded to, the Trump administration has a particular view of Iran that I think is congenial to your own view and to the view in the Gulf. But then on the side of the Democratic Party, we have a very different view of Iran and a very different view of Iran's neighbors. So, for example, you mentioned Qassem Soleimani's killing. This was a killing that both Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren referred to as an assassination. I believe Elizabeth Warren referred to Qassem Soleimani as a senior military official, right? As if he was like the postmaster general of Iran.
I don't think he said military even. It was almost as if he was a clerk in a state library.
I'm fairly certain she said senior foreign military official. But you also have on the side of the Democratic Party, of course, a very different view of Saudi Arabia. The presumptive nominee of the Democratic Party, Joe Biden, in November, I believe it was, said that he would, in Democratic Party debate, said that he would make Saudi Arabia into a pariah, his quote. So can you explain for me just how we got to this stage where the view of Iran and the view of Iran's neighbors has become such a clearly partisan issue? Because that does seem to me to be a novel development.
That's an excellent question, I think. I think the two issues have to be separated in order to embark on creating any sort of meaningful policy. But Saudi Arabia is bad. There's no reason, is no excuse to use when assessing the Iranian threat to the world or the region or anywhere else in the world. We're not here to do moral comparisons of countries, but that is the tool that is used by people that are proponents of bringing Iran out of the cold, quote unquote. The idea of why are we enemies with Iran? We're friends with Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia doesn't share our values on X issue, Y issue, G issue, F issue. Therefore, we should reconsider our enmity with Iran. But that, again, fundamentally mischaracterizes the reason why there is an enmity with Iran. The reason why there's an enmity with Iran isn't because it's nastier than X or Y other Middle Eastern country. It's because Iran has been actively seeking, again, to upend what it perceives as a U.S.-led regional order, and has the blood of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of U.S. servicemen on its hands, and on a daily basis reminds people that what it's trying to upend is this Western order in the region. There's no other country in the Middle East that wakes up in the morning and says, by the way, this is what I'm here to do, this is what I exist to achieve, and the Iranian Revolution will prevail, and these are the basic tenets of the Iranian Revolution. Unfortunately, what we see in the United States is that there is this tendency to use Saudi Arabia against Iran and to use Iran against Saudi Arabia in partisan debates about these two countries. It's perfectly normal, perfectly rational for one to have an opinion on the value system that exists in Saudi Arabia and its divergences from the value system that exists in the United States. There are several, that's an endless discussion that one can have online. But I don't think there's a place for that discussion when assessing the Iranian threat for what it is, geopolitically and otherwise. And is there, just to answer your question, is there, has Saudi Arabia become much more so a partisan item than it was in the past? Of course, 100%. I mean, in the past, the support for Saudi Arabia has largely been bipartisan, but I think this, to a large degree, is a result of this, strange time we're in under President Trump. One Emirati friend in Washington, D.C. once told me that, Saudi Arabia is now like a piñata. Everybody in D.C. is wearing a blindfold and trying to swing at Saudi Arabia. But they don't want the piñata itself. They want to break the piñata and get the candy inside. And the candy inside is the Trump administration. So the idea is that there are foundations that there are important matters that act as a foundation for the U.S.-Saudi relationship. This relationship collapsed the Soviet Union. This relationship intervened and helped and acted in many ways on the international level and regionally to bring about joint political and geopolitical interests and goals. And it will continue to be useful so long as it's useful. So it is a partisan issue today, but so many times we've seen that one issue or another becomes a very hotly debated partisan issue, and then next election cycle it's not that anymore. So true, it's something that is a partisan issue, but I don't think it will remain to be such a hotly discussed and such a urgent policy issue, so long as there is real basis for the relationship.
How would you respond, Mohammed, to those who might say, who might argue that part of the reason that Saudi Arabia has come to be in such poor odor in many segments of the American foreign policy establishment is because of, the quality of decisions that have emerged from the Saudi leadership in the last couple of years, and certain fairly dramatic missteps and such as the killing of Jamal Khashoggi or the Yemeni adventure. How would you respond to people who point to those instances as the real drivers of this reconsideration of Saudi Arabia and Iran that's happening in some segments of the American foreign policy?
First of all, I'd like to say that the killing of Jamal Khashoggi was a horrible, horrible crime that should be condemned every day, everywhere, always. I knew Jamal very well for many, many years. And that definitely was a dark spot in Saudi Arabia and the region's history, of course. Again, there was outrage as a result of the Jamal Khashoggi killing and murder in the consulate in Istanbul. There continues to be outrage. And one of the reasons that we hear outrage about this murder, much more so than we hear outrage about Iranian assassinations in Europe or Syrian assassinations in Europe, is that Saudi Arabia does not conduct itself in this way. This type of foreign policy is a hallmark of Iranian regime foreign policy, when it's assassinating dissidents across Europe. Saudi Arabia doesn't operate this way. It's never operated this way. So this does come as a shock to Saudi Arabians. It comes as a shock to everyone else. Again, the trials are ongoing right now. There is a realization that this is a catastrophe that has to be dealt with in Saudi Arabia. So that's on the Jamal issue. On other matters that you mentioned, no country in the world doesn't make mistakes. The United States made endless mistakes in the region. Many would say that the invasion of Iraq was a mistake. Policy in Afghanistan, in many ways, was a mistake. In many ways, did well. But the point to consider here is that Saudi Arabia has long been accused of being lazy by policy circles in the United States. It's always, the Saudis have to carry their own weight. They've got all of these shiny weapons. They've got all of these security concerns. Why don't they do their own share of the work in the region? And once Saudi Arabia, and this was not the case with Saudi Arabia in the past. Saudi policy was extremely risk-averse. It was very slow. It was almost lethargic at times. In order to get coherent policy action by Saudi Arabia in the past, it would take a lot of deliberation. It would go through a very long-winded process. That changed. And that changed sharply. And with any sharp change, there will be missteps and there will be ways to optimize how things are done. The Yemen war, for example, was a step in that direction. And again, the Yemen war, I'm sure it could have been prosecuted in a better way, but all wars at the end of the day have laundry lists of violations and ways that they could have been optimized. But one has to consider what the alternative to Saudi Arabia was at that point in time, after the Houthi government took over Sana'a and drove out the legitimate government backed by the United Nations in the deal overseen by Saudi Arabia, the power sharing deal with Abdullah Saleh. The alternative would have been to give an Iranian-backed militia control over all of Yemen, to give Bab al-Mandeb to the Revolutionary Guards. That's something at the end of the day, were it to happen, would never be accepted in any Western capital. It would never be accepted in the United States. Iranian control over both the Strait of Hormuz and Bab al-Mandeb is just an idea that is unacceptable. It's unacceptable for Egypt even. That means they control they effectively control the Suez Canal whenever they like. So the idea of allowing Iran to set up a foothold in Yemen by controlling the central government in Sana'a was something that was unacceptable to many actors in the world, and that's why I think there was wide-ranging support for Saudi Arabia's intervention in the form of UN Resolution 2216 and the US and European support, as well as the Arab coalition that came around Saudi Arabia to protect that. Again, that's one of the differences in lenses that I've been talking about. This is viewed as just an invasion of Yemen in certain Western policy circles, whereas in the Arab world, it's viewed as Iran sticking its nose where it doesn't belong. Yemen is the stronghold of Arabs. It's where the Arabs first came from. Everybody's seen what Iran has done in Iraq, what Iran has done in Lebanon, and the idea that they would come to the poorest Arab nation, set up a foothold there, and do what they do in the Arabian Gulf, in the Bab al-Mandeb, was something that in many ways repulsed people, regardless of what their political backgrounds were in the region. And that's, I think, the missing part of the equation when it comes to assessing why Saudi Arabia went into Yemen and why it's in there.
Wonderful. I do want to open this for discussion, but first I want to come to my co-host, Professor Matt Bunn, who has a question.
I was asking for a little more detail on the tangible results in the region of maximum pressure. And similarly, you said that Soleimani's deputy would never be able to, or at least would take a while to recover the loss of Soleimani. And I wondered, he's been Soleimani's deputy for a long, long time. I would have to guess that he had a lot of the connections that Soleimani had, if not the charisma. They must have been planning for this possibility that, Soleimani did a lot of dangerous things and he was a smart guy. He must have thought about, okay, what happens if I die? So I wondered if you could talk about what we've actually seen in terms of changes of militia behavior or IRGC behavior since Soleimani's death.
Sure. These are both excellent questions. I'll start with the Ghani and Soleimani question. I think the Iranians didn't know what was coming when Qassem Soleimani was eliminated in Baghdad. I think he wasn't taking precautions too much by flying from Lebanon to Iraq. And I'd like to bring the example of the first time that the United States and the Israeli intelligence had Qassem Soleimani in their crosshairs, and that was in 2008 under the Obama administration. Twice before, the United States had Qassem Soleimani in the crosshairs. And that, I'll speak about the second. The first time actually was in a convoy where he was headed towards Erbil, and then for one reason or another, the Pentagon said, don't pull the trigger, don't take out Qassem Soleimani. The second time was in 2008 in Damascus. And the target at that point in time was not Mustafa Badruddin. He was killed in 2008. I can't believe I forgot. The senior Hezbollah operative. That operative was actually very, very careful in his movements. And the way he was caught, it was a joint operation. Ahmad Moghnia, thank you, from Francis Karam. I can't believe I forgot the name. I've written papers about him. Thank you. So Ahmad Moghnia was very careful in his movements. And the way he was caught is that he was visiting his mistress in Damascus. And Mossad have been tracking that for a while. And at one point in time, a satellite image or a drone image, I think it was, in real time was capturing Ahmad Mughniya leaning on his car with Qassem Soleimani next to him. And then as people would know in the room, I imagine the bomb that killed Ahmad Mughniya was placed inside the headrest of his car while he was visiting his mistress. That attack was called off by the United States, and the Israelis were told to stand down. And the rationale for both times that Soleimani was in the crosshairs of the United States /and/or Israel was that this is a can of worms, and we don't want to go there. This man can truly damage U.S. interests and U.S. servicemen in the region. There was this sort of unwritten rule where Qassem Soleimani wouldn't be targeted. Again, throughout that period didn't mean that he stopped targeting Americans. He continued to target Americans. He was still a threat to Americans. It's worth having a discussion as to why eliminating him was off the table at that point in time. But now, if you look at the lingo that was used by the Trump administration, they very clearly say, that he was across the river or the marsh from the U.S. Embassy compound, and he was planning attacks on the U.S. Embassy and on U.S. servicemen, and that's why the decision was made to eliminate Qassem Soleimani. That's on the Soleimani thing. And this deputy, the deputy, sure, he's not charismatic, but again, his focus, and again, this is just my speculation. I could be wrong. Time will tell exactly how and if he will fill the shoes of Qassem Soleimani. His expertise lies in the Afghanistan region. He knows the Al-Qaeda operatives very well. He was the person who dealt to a large degree with Hamza bin Laden and Zarqawi and all of these other Al-Qaeda officials that were harbored at one time or another in Iran. He's the one who dealt with Hekmatyar. He was the one who dealt with the Taliban. At that point in time, it was the U.S. presence in Afghanistan that drove this odd alliance between Sunni jihadists and the Iranian regime. And the point was to deplete the resources and efforts of the United States and target Americans in Afghanistan. So that is his area of expertise. In fact, after all of this time, he was pitched to the Iraqis as an ambassador to Baghdad, to the Afghanis, as an ambassador to Kabul, and the Afghanis said, no, we don't want Ani to come anywhere close to Afghanistan. So it's a different set of traits that happen. And this is not to say that Ghani is not capable, or that he is not a professional, or he's not a product of the rigor of the Quds Force. That's not to say that. It's just to say that Qassem Soleimani truly was an extraordinary figure in his charisma. And I met several people that actually sat down with him. The way even opponents of his would speak about him. He had a certain charisma. He made people feel like they were special, like he gave them their undivided attention. Add to that the zeal that he showed and the prowess that he had. Having that mixture in one person, having all of these traits in one person, is something you only come across once, maybe in 100 years. And that was a huge asset for the Revolutionary Guards. And again, I can't stress enough how this idea that this is not important, he can be replaced tomorrow. No, he can't be replaced. Replacing Qassem Soleimani is going to be very difficult. And not just because of his wide network and his wide network of friendships, but because of the quality of the relationships that he has, not just the number of relationships.
Okay, I would like us to get to some more questions.
I'm sorry, Tarek, there was just one more question, and it was about maximum pressure, how it manifested. So sure, Bashar al-Assad has been making gains in Syria, but Iranian leverage has been waning to a large degree after the maximum pressure campaign. What we're seeing is that the Russians have been stepping up much more than before on issues that concern the ground in Syria. Before, they controlled the air, but now they are very much involved in ground operations in Syria with the regime, and that the involvement of Turkey also falls into this. But the influence that Iran used to wield in Syria as a result of its resources and its militias has waned to a large extent. But that I wouldn't say is the most important. Neither that nor its influence on Hezbollah. I wouldn't say either of those are the most important manifestation of a regressing Iranian power in the region. I would say the Iraqi protests are, where you have thousands upon thousands of young Iraqis in the streets chanting against Qassem Soleimani verbatim, or against other Shia leaders, or against Khamenei. That's something that would have been unheard of in the past, and that's testament to how demographics in the region have fundamentally changed. The old formula that Iran used of resistance, anti-imperialism, using Shia propaganda and ideology to target Arab Shia populations and indoctrinate and create organizations and militias around that. That's something young people are not buying in the region. It's not just in Iraq; it's elsewhere in the region. Young people want jobs. They see that their parents afforded houses and put them through school, and they don't have any prospect of finding a job, let alone owning their own house in the future. In the past, this type of ideology, revolutionary ideology, was used alongside economic assistance to win over masses in countries like Iraq and elsewhere. Today, there's no economic aspect here, and people aren't buying this sort of ideological mobilization in any case, let alone as a substitute for meaningful economic reform or meaningful government reform. So what we're seeing now in Iraq, this utter rejection of Iranian influence and of Iranian-backed candidates and prime minister. These are things that didn't make it to the US media, unfortunately, very unfortunately. But the protest movement in Iraq was one of the most inspirational movements, and listening to what these people were saying in the street was actually fascinating. It was a rejection, a total rejection within the Shia areas of Iraq of anything that had to do with Iran. And one of the reasons for that is that Iran truly drove the Iraqi economy in the dirt by using it as a sanctions circumvention tool and by installing essentially warlords answerable to the Revolutionary Guards as the entity that exercises the monopoly of the use of force in the country. It's not state security, it's the Hash that exercises brute force in that country.
One thing I will say is that given the vagaries of internet connections, etc., please try to keep your question succinct and to the point. Make sure that it is a question and ends in a question mark. And even though we are all joining this call from the comfort of our own homes, we should think of ourselves as collectively on Harvard's campus. And so the norms of decorum and sort of respectful discourse that apply on that campus should apply on this call as well. So I see the first hand that I have up is by Shahab Asuda. So I'm going to unmute you and allow you to ask your question of Mr. Mohammed Alyahya.
Okay, thank you so much for your great talk. I really enjoyed that. I have two questions. Both of them are very, very short. So first one, so how much do you think that the Iran recent behavior in the region is somehow the response to the Saudi kingdom hostility toward Iranian people and Iranian government?
Sorry, just could you repeat the last part?
So the Saudis' hostility toward Iranian people and Iranian government, especially in the financial support of separatists and terrorist organization like Jundullah al-Ahwaz in the southern part of Iran. So that's actually my first question. The second question is, you mentioned that Saudi doesn't want war in the region. But John Kerry in a Munich Security Conference in 2018, he mentioned that the Saudi king and I think Egyptian president asked US several times to bomb Iran. So who should we believe, you or John Kerry? Thank you so much.
Thank you.
In terms of the first question, I think what Iran is doing in the region is primarily a response to the United States and to the maximum pressure campaign that exists with the United States. There have been periods of time where there was détente or rapprochement between the Iranians and the Saudis, primarily during the Khatami and Rafsanjani eras. But the current escalation in the region, I think, is directly a response to the U.S. Withdrawing from the JCPOA and enacting the maximum pressure on Iran. It's not the Saudis that are pressuring Iran economically, but the Americans that are pressuring Iran economically. In terms of, sorry, the second part of the question was John Kerry. Yeah, John Kerry mentioning that the Saudis asked to bomb Iran. I don't think that's true. I don't know what John Kerry was basing what he said on, but I don't think we have to look any further than the Saudi responses to Iran's attacks on Saudi oil facilities. Those were an act of war, 100%. I would say that every Houthi attack on Saudi Arabia with the Iranian ballistic missiles was also an act of war. If Saudi Arabia did want war with Iran, it had many opportunities to spark a war with Iran, to create a regional conventional military conflict backed by the United States. But time and again, we've seen that Saudi Arabia and other regional actors that would be, within the most sensitive conflict zones have chosen not to go to war. But again, we shouldn't conflate that with, a commitment to any measures that limit Iran's capabilities to conduct its foreign policy.
Thank you. The next question I have here is from Yusuf Azizi. I will unmute him.
Hello, thank you for your talk. My name is Yusuf Azizi. I'm a PhD candidate from Virginia Tech School of Public and International Affairs. It's not a surprise that I disagree with 90% of what you talk, but let's have some productive and hopeful talk here. So I have a question about the future. And it seems that from the perspective of grand strategy of United States, not the difference between Republican and Democrat, the priority of Middle East for United States grand strategy is becoming lower and lower in comparison to, for example, East Asia, Southeast Asia, or Eastern Europe. So I was wondering if the recent activities by Saudis, as you said previously, somebody says that it is lazy. I don't agree with that. But these current activities, harsh activities by Saudis in the region, Yemen, Bahrain, or elsewhere. So it's because that they fear that United States maybe sooner or later leave the region or reduce the footprint in the Middle East or west of Asia. And the second point here is that several times Iranian officials has been offering the the regional security talk with Saudis, with all countries in the region, and always rejected by Saudi. So do you see any hope in this regard that these countries sit together and talk about the regional securities? All has regional, I know, has concerns, but needs to negotiate with each other. Thank you.
Thanks for your question. No, I don't think that's very likely. I think, and part of the answer to your question was inside your question. Is Saudi Arabia worried about the United States leaving the region? Is Saudi Arabia willing to act without the United States and sit down and find a regional security framework? The reality of the matter is that the perception of the Iranian state, of Iran by most Arab states, is that it is a belligerent, expansionist actor. That's what you'll hear when you talk to people in this region. Jawad Zarif's idea about hope, or whatever it was called, about creating this maritime security framework and a larger regional security framework is frankly laughed at in Saudi Arabia or everywhere else in the Gulf, because if you look at the top 10, top 15 national security issues that they have across the region, all of them to one extent or another would tie back to Iran. You could disagree with their assessments, maybe you say they're overemphasized on Iran or not, but it is Iranian presence that they consider a problem in Iraq, the same in Syria, the same in Lebanon, the same in Bahrain, the same in Yemen. So it's not as much fear of Iran, of the United States vacating the region that I think pushes countries like Saudi Arabia to intervene in places in Yemen, rather than avoiding the fate that has befallen Iraq or Syria or Lebanon. Yemen is already a problematic state, and it has a border with Saudi Arabia. So avoiding a situation of state failure and Iranian control like Baghdad is something that is a sentiment shared by all of Arabs. Again, the perception among many people in the Gulf and the Arab world is that the misfortune, poverty, and state failure that we see in places like Iraq, Lebanon, and Syria is a direct result of Iranian imperialism and expansionism. So that's pretty much the idea. And again, the Iranian, Mr. Jawad Zarif's ideas about creating a security framework, one official here in the Gulf, laughingly said, the only people that should be on that table are the Revolutionary Guards that never even pick up his phone. anyways, and that this is a joke that it's something that's left out. If there is decision making, it comes from Khamenei and from his revolutionary guards, and it seems that these actors are hell-bent on actualizing revolutionary ideals across the region, and they've gotten very, very, very good at it, and they've already invested in this framework in the region. So again, the idea of sharing the region, the idea of cutting it up, Saudi Arabia doesn't have expansionist aspirations in the region. It doesn't have proxy building tools. It has a conventional army that it will push back against when it sees conventional threats. Yemen is a case in point. But the idea of sharing the region assumes that there are two imperialistic poles or two expansionist poles. That's not something that's part of Saudi policy and decision making. And the idea of removing the United States is not something that Saudi Arabia is eagerly looking after, or even thinks that's beneficial. It's bringing stability in the region and containing the influence of the Revolutionary Guards that I think is the priority, both for Saudi Arabia and the current U.S. administration, and for a large part of Arab populations and governments, of course.
Okay, the next question I have is by Cameron Khansarinia.
Thank you so much, Professor, and thank you, Mr. Alyahya, for your time. You mentioned in your talk, I should say, actually, I'm a graduate of the college in the class of 2018 and the policy director now at the National Union for Democracy in Iran. You mentioned the really inspiring protests in Iraq, in Basra, in Baghdad, in Karbala, of all places, against the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, against the influence of the Islamic Republic. But we've seen those protests at even larger scales and equally inspirational in Iran itself against the Islamic Republic. And these protests are not merely economic, but ones that call for an end to the regime in its entirety and for the establishment of a secular democracy. But today's conversation has been based on engagement of many forms between the Arab world, the United States, and the Islamic Republic as a government. What will it take for the Arab world or the United States to catch up to where the Iranian people are, which is they're asking for a dialogue with them, with their secular democratic opposition, and bypassing the Islamic Republic, which has a 40-year track record of not only oppressing the world, but oppressing them first and foremost. So what will it take to get the Arab world and the US on the track of the Iranian people and following their lead and saying, deal with us, not our regime? Thank you.
I mean, I think that's a good question. The part about the United States, I think, is more relevant and more pertinent than the part about the regional actors. I don't think that countries in the region are going to create any campaigns where they target the Iranian population. They're not going to interfere directly in what's going on inside Iran. Too many actors in the region, I would expect that presents too large of a set of risks. The idea is to contain the current Iranian regime and the way it is using Iran's resources in the region. The United States, that's a good question. I think we've seen much more messaging directed directly at the Iranian people by the State Department today, whether it's by Brian Hook or by the Secretary of State. Again, yeah, I see that there's engagement with the protest movement by the current U.S. administration, much more than we saw in 2009 from the Obama administration. But yeah, than that, I don't have much to say.
Okay, our next questioner is Salim. Go ahead.
Hello. I would like to start by just saying thank you all for putting this together. I think the perspectives that were shared here were things that really need to be discussed. I'm going to keep my question really short. And this is sort of a follow-up question to Professor Matt Burns' question. So basically, with maximum pressure, yes, we did see tangible results, but I think that we're also seeing severe side effects. So in context of the title of your talk, what do you foresee as the worst case scenario?
That's a good question. First of all, let's put things back into perspective. I think the worst case scenario could be what we experienced towards the end of the last administration's tenure in the White House. Iran was given almost $1.5 billion in euros and in dollars in cash, and we've seen that sanctions were incrementally lifted on Iran, and that there was to a large degree a normalization of its regional posture. Today we see a reversal of that. Today we see an Iran that is pressured. So even if a deal comes out now, and I think a worse scenario would be that we see something like the JCPOA +1, where we've got a nuclear deal, maybe with some amendments on sunset clauses or an improvement here or there, and then it's declared a victory and everything goes back to normal, and Iran doubles down on its activities in the region. I think that would be an unfavorable outcome, to say the least. But that's one. The worst outcome to that, I think, is conventional war, where Iran's military, as weak, dated, and dysfunctional as it is pitted against more well-equipped militaries that are backed by stronger powers. Inevitably, Iran would be at a disadvantage. Iran would lose. But at the end of the day, of course, there is no winner in any war. There is just a series of losers, some of which lose more than others. Inevitably, Iran would lose more than everybody else. But again, everybody would lose at the end of that. And I think that's a pretty bad scenario.
And Mohammed, your sense of the best case scenario, or if everything unfolds as you think it should unfold, what happens? Are you looking for a regime change in Iran? Tell me the story by which Iran transforms into the kind of neighbor that Saudi Arabia and its other neighbors would be happy to have.
One former White House official is a good friend of mine. I won't name him. He says, this is a joke that he starts many of his talks with. He says, it's the job of the United States to teach Iran geography. And it's a funny joke, but I think it's a very important concept. The ideal scenario is for Iran to cut its losses in Iraq and elsewhere, to confine itself to its borders, just like militarily and otherwise, just like everybody else in the region does, and work towards normalizing, opening up to the world. Iran is a fantastic country with a great and rich history. Iran has ski slopes. It has, the Caspian Sea. It has beaches. It's got a highly educated population. It's got beautiful landscapes, very rich history. There is no reason for Iran not to be, an economic powerhouse. It just chooses a path that is contrary to that. So the ideal scenario, I think, is the same ideal scenario for anywhere in the world, for Europe, for the United States, for the region, and it's to see an Iran that does not pose a daily national security threat to anybody, but one that is focused inwards. But that is, being idealistic. That's probably not going to manifest, which takes us to the other point, and this is a point that I should have made in the beginning of my presentation, and it is that sanctions can be an end in and of themselves. Detractors of Trump's strategy always point that the maximum pressure campaign did not bring Iran to the table. First of all, maximum pressure campaigns or campaigns to pressure, they take time. In order to enact real pressure or real economic blows on Iran, that will take a year, 2 years, perhaps 3 years. That comes with time. But often that argument overlooks the fact that depriving a regime like Iran of the resources that it needs to keep up its problematic and deadly behavior in the region could be an end in and of itself. One can say, okay, these people are bad actors in the Revolutionary Guards. They've got access to US dollars. We're left with many hundreds of thousands of dead Syrians and ethnic cleansing and genocide in that country, dysfunction in Iraq. All of that was a result of that regime having the resources to conduct its foreign policy. Limiting those resources is a good way to deal with that dynamic at the minimum level. So that's enough.
So the idea is that if enough pressure and pain is applied to Iran, they will, in your view, adjust or correct their behavior.
It's a long shot, in my opinion. But the idea that depriving them of the resource or sanctioning them can be an end in and of itself is something that I think we should be more comfortable with intellectually. If they are using these resources on cultivating proxies in the region that are responsible for genocide, ethnic cleansing, etc., rather than on their own people's economic prosperity, then a long-term sanctions regime against Khamenei's political system is probably the right thing to do for the region and for Iran.
Okay, our next question is from Dr. Ariel Petrovich. Go ahead.
Thank you for this presentation. This was a very useful way to sort of get multiple perspectives. I wanted to return focus just a little bit to the nuclear issue as well, which obviously, you know, there's a number of issues that we have been dealing with Iran on for many years. The regional actions have been going on for decades, so has the nuclear program. But I'm wondering how, if we were to shift focus towards regional activities, how would basically ignoring the nuclear program and sort of allowing proliferation to continue unmonitored or uncontrolled, do you think that would basically Iran being able to break out, test, and maybe develop a nuclear weapon, would that affect its ability to act in the region in a different way? So basically, in the region, you know, we've had simmering problems for many, many years, and they haven't really been going away for a long time. But the nuclear problem seems like one that could be an imminent game changer. So do you think that Iran, if it were able to develop and test a nuclear weapon, would that change its ability to act in the region beyond what we've seen so far?
I'm not going to discuss the merits of a nuclear deal as a nuclear accord because I don't think that's a topic of discussion here. But it's important to consider that the nuclear deal does not ensure that Iran is a nuclear weapon-free country forever. There's an expiration date to it. There has to be a new deal that is negotiated at some point in the future in order to ensure that Iran complies and continues to comply. So there are many detractors to the deal itself, saying that it wasn't the best deal that was signed between Iran and the United States. And again, you know, I remember the time it was signed, there was a sort of fear-mongering in that members of the Obama administration, people close to them, were saying that if there is no deal signed in July, then there will be a war in August. That's not true. If the deal wasn't signed in July, there could have been more negotiations. I think there was a little bit they were a little bit too eager to sign a deal and not the perfect deal. Again, if the nuclear deal stays as it was, we would see by the time that it expires, or by the time that Iran were in a place that it could develop a nuclear weapon, we could see a region that is totally, crippled by the Revolutionary Guards. We could see an Iraq-like situation in other countries, Yemen, maybe other regions, maybe regions in Africa. So the idea that, again, ignoring Iran's regional actions was cause for concern during President Obama's tenure. And to answer your question about the militias always being there, it's true. Iran has cultivated militias more or less since it was founded. But we have seen an extreme uptick in 2011. And 2011 is when the nuclear deal negotiations actually began. We saw doubling down of Iranian influence in Syria that claimed the lives of hundreds of thousands of people. We've seen doubling down of Iran's influence in Iraq, much more so than pre-2011, Hashd-al-Sha'bi, etc. And we've seen, more direct control of the political process in Lebanon. So all of these things, have costs to them. Costs in terms of the future prosperity of these countries, costs in terms of human lives. Hundreds of thousands of people have died. Millions have suffered economically as a result of these Iranian actions. And again, I value your questions because I think it really does wrap up what the crux of this presentation is. That is what people in the region focus on much more so than the nuclear issue. So it really shows the two different languages, I would say. Thank you.
Thank you. The next question is from Katrina Lago.
Hi, good afternoon, and thank you very much for the talk. I'm from George Washington University, and I had a question going back to what you mentioned about Trump posting a lot of his foreign policy on Twitter. And April 22nd, President Trump had posted direction for the U.S. Navy to destroy Iranian boats that harassed its ships. So my question for you was, how do you see the changes on the operational level for the IRA or IRGC in response to this, or has it changed, or will it change due to the COVID concerns? And what will that maritime picture look like in the near term? Thank you.
That's a great question, I think, and I think that the Iranian little provocation that happened recently, where they harassed U.S. ships, is its latest iteration of its incremental and systematic escalation campaign after the killing of Qassem Soleimani. Do I see a difference in Iranian harassment during the Trump administration? 100%. It's night and day. During Obama's tenure, we saw that this type of harassment would happen, once every couple of months at least. And more importantly, we saw that the Revolutionary Guards, seized a U.S. ship full of Marines near Farsi Island, and made them go on their knees before handcuffing them, took those pictures, and then released on public television, state television, that the U.S. Marines cried and that the kindness of the Revolutionary Guards to detain them in Farsi Island is what caused them to relax. Those ships were not in Iranian waters. That was at the height of the friendliness, so to speak, between Iran and the United States. Any rational actor would expect the Iranians to send a bunch of sandwiches and an engineer if a U.S. ship broke down, and not arrest Americans. But I think the reason that the Iranians acted that way at that time is because they were very certain that there would be no response by the United States because of the firmness of the Obama administration's policy in favor of Iran and in favor of rapprochement. So there wasn't much that the Iranians could do in the way of harassing or provoking the United States that would elicit any harmful response to Iran. So I think the calculus was, let's flex our muscles, let's saber rattle for domestic consumption and humiliate Americans because we know that there's not going to be a response. What happened with the killing of Qassem Soleimani is that the United States had a form of escalation dominance. They didn't respond to any of the incremental small escalations on the Iranian side, the downing of missiles, downing of drones, attacks on pipelines, attacks on Aramco, etc. But then they were met with a very disproportionate and debilitating blow in the killing of Qassem Soleimani and Abu Muhandis. Now what they're seeing is that they're trying to test the waters once more, and the response by Trump on Twitter is, I will sink these ships. He said that he would respond forcefully after if an American was targeted. He did. And now it remains to be seen whether they will send ships to harass U.S. crafts again. But it's important to consider that this is the only example of the harassment of U.S. military ships since the maximum pressure campaign started. And I think deterrence is a function of clarity. If it's clear that there will be a response by the Americans that's demonstrated, then that gives the United States deterrence. During the last administration's tenure, it really didn't matter that the United States had 12 aircraft carriers and the rest of the world had 11 aircraft carriers combined, because there was an unwavering belief in Iran that military force will not be used against the Islamic Republic, and it was taken advantage of. So in a way, this sort of Twitter diplomacy and wild card approach to dealing with Iran does have an effect on the decision-making process of the Revolutionary Guards and of Khamenei, especially since the last response by the United States, the elimination of Qassem Soleimani, really dealt a huge blow operationally to the Islamic Republic. The question of what the Americans will do next if there is a transgression is something that I think is being discussed in Tehran until today.
Thank you. So we have time for 2 more questions. So we'll try to keep them brief. And Mohammed, I would just ask if you can, to just improve the sound quality, if you can just direct your speech into the microphone on your computer. So the next question I have is from Dr. Khalid Saeed of the Middle East Initiative.
Hi, I have a question about the Saudi perspective. About what happened when Iran attacked the oil facilities. Now, you're saying that, the smart response was not to do anything. And I guess from a Saudi government's perspective, what is the red line considered by the Saudi government that if attacked, or if Iran attacked certain, other areas or cities, then that would be a red line, and that would, prompt a military response by Saudi Arabia, because there's a large consensus in the region that actually what happened was just a simple sign of weakness by Saudi Arabia, because Iran would not dare to attack other countries in the region in the way that they did Saudi Arabia. Like, for instance, they would not attack Egypt because they know that they would get a very powerful response. So what does Saudi Arabia consider a red line?
I think that's a good question. First of all, I don't purport to speak for the Saudi government in any way. I can only speculate as to what they're thinking about. But there's several parts to this question. First, there is an understanding, I think, in the region that maximum pressure hurts. It works, and it hurts. And it will cause lashing out on the part of the Iranian regime. The ideal scenario for the Iranian regime is to raise the threat level of or the risk level of conventional war. Conventional war scares everybody, and if everybody's scared enough, then people will start to U-turn on the maximum pressure, give concessions to Iran, and give them the lifeline that they need to support their regional network. It's a trap. That's how it's viewed, I think, by many people in Washington and in the region, that these are all traps, this Iranian incremental escalation. So if there is any possibility to outright ignore them and keep the maximum pressure mounting, that is the most apt and effective way to deal with these traps. The second part of your question is, there is an element of international, of putting the onus on the international community to act when the global energy supply is attacked. When a place like Ras Al Noura is attacked, it's not just Saudi sovereignty that is infringed upon. It's not just Saudi Arabia that is attacked, but it is the supply, the global energy supply that allows us all to use our cars, that allows us all to live in a 21st century world that is under attack. And that's something that should be protected by the international community. And the same applies, by the way, to Yemen. Securing the Bab el-Mandeb Straits and ensuring the free flow of energy as well as goods through that strait and off to Suez and through the Mediterranean, wherever it's going to go. That is something that is the international community's responsibility. That's something that is protected in cooperation with and in deliberation with the international community. And that is exactly what we saw after the attacks on Iran. A unilateral response to that would have been difficult for those two reasons. One, the attack was much more than an attack just on Saudi Arabia. And two, this was something that was totally expected as a result of the maximum pressure campaign. And in fact, testament to the fact that it is effective. The fact that the Iranian regime is taking risks that are this big.
But I mean, if I just may add one more comment about the maximum pressure campaign, I think it's something that the last 3 decades have taught us about Iran's, experience in the Middle East is that the maximum pressure campaign did not work. Their influence has gotten bigger. Their reach is far, greater in the region. So maximum pressure campaign is not working as far as what it is supposed to accomplish, and it's only being used as a cry with the Iranian people, because the Iranian government can use these I guess, points of, well, the maximum pressure campaign, this is done by the U.S. and the Western allies in cooperation with Saudi Arabia and the Gulf to try to punish the Iranian people, when it's not. So the maximum pressure campaign has not worked. So at some point,
I disagree. I think I disagree, and I would invite you to look at what we saw in Iraq. The lack of popularity that we've been seeing in Iraq for the Iranian regime, the hatred that we've been seeing by young Iraqis for the Iranian-controlled political system in that country, in the ongoing protests that have gone on in Iraq, is alarming. That's something that took everybody in the policy world by storm. Seeing young Shias rejecting their own political leadership, rejecting Iran, chanting against religious figures that once enjoyed sanctity and would never be spoken out against in public is testament to that. And also, the amount of protests that we've been seeing in Iran since the New Year's of 2017 protests, very recently in and Mashhad, in areas that were considered the backbone of the regime, we've seen people coming out in droves in the street, not against the sanctions regime of the United States, but against Khamenei himself for the first time in the history of the Islamic Republic. And this was happening concurrently in dozens of cities all over Iran. We see photos, videos of young students in Iran that refuse to walk on top of American flags that are laid out there by the regime for them to step on a daily basis. Those are the same students that end up in jail for protesting against the regime. So the signs of the maximum pressure campaign, I think, are very abundant, and I think it is working based on the change in public sentiment in Arab countries and in Iran against the regime, but also the operational obstacles that are put in front of the IRGC now. That's finding it very difficult to pay its militiamen in Iraq and elsewhere amid the shortage of US dollars as in that country. And again, the third thing that shows this is the desperation that the Iranian regime has to get these sanctions reversed. It is willing to risk conventional war. It is willing to go to lengths that it's never gone to before, to kill US servicemen, to attack oil facilities in Saudi Arabia. These all reek of desperation. Nobody acts like that unless the maximum pressure campaign that's mounted on them is extremely effective. And I think that's what demonstrates its effectiveness.
This is a longer conversation. We only have time for one more question, but I will say, Mohammed, I guess it's sort of challenging to say that Iran's quote-unquote bad behavior is evidence that maximum pressure is working, when Iran's bad behavior is why you are pursuing a maximum pressure policy. And so I would be interested in knowing how one falsifies this idea that maximum pressure is or is not working.
But there's a difference between the escalation against US interests directly, like attack on ships, attack on drones, that's one thing. But the cultivation of the long-term regional proxy network is the other thing. It is the threat to that regional system that it has in place. Over 100 Shia militias. Probably one of the curses to Iran is the sheer size of its proxy network. It got too big to maintain. So when that regional proxy network, that long-term installation in the region that ensures the protection of Iranian expansionism, when that's under threat, it resorts to upping the ante, and it resorts to attaching a cost to the maximum pressure campaign in the hopes that there is a reversal that allows for economic breathing room that will in turn allow for the cultivation of the regional proxy. So they're two different concepts, I think.
Fair enough. Let me come to our last question by Dr. Masa Ruhi, who is one of our collaborators in this enterprise. Go ahead.
Thank you, and thank you for your talk and presenting such a comprehensive sort of Saudi view on Iran in the region and on the US. So my question, I'll try to be quick, builds up of what Tarek a couple of times mentioned, and also this sort of last little debate. I wish there was more time to have back and forth. I obviously, those of you who read my stuff disagree on the maximum pressure strategy and its effectiveness, but I actually want to press you on this a little more in using your own responses. And I think there is a contradiction that I'm trying to understand in what you're saying. For me, if you were going to say the maximum pressure strategy is effective, and Iran is being, escalating even more, and that's the sign of desperation. And look at what they're willing to do. They're willing to risk, you just said, a conventional war. So then if, as a part of your other comments, you had said, you think even if it leads to a war, it's still worth the strategy because the end game should be weakening Iran, even if it leads to a war, then I would have understood your logic. However, if your argument is that war will only have a series of losers and no winners, then I cannot put these two together, because as using your argument, it doesn't seem like Iran will, in the long run, continue to just sit by with the sanctions. And many of their activities could get much worse, including the missiles, which are a huge threat to the Gulf countries, including Saudi Arabia. Their advanced technological missiles and more sort of with even more advanced warfare technologies, they're not going to detract from the cost from that, no matter what the sanctions. They're going to let the people die from hunger, but they will not detract from those. So that is not going to go away. It's going to make things even worse. A lot of their regional activities are at low cost. So this is not a long game. It's either ending in a conflict or in an Iran that is some version of a North Korea in the region that is not even inward looking. So I really want to hear, what is your, as Tarek mentioned, what is your best case scenario? And how do you square the possibility of war with this maximum strategy that is just
sure. I think that's a good question. And it reminds me to some extent about this false binary that we see sometimes in the discourse on Iran. It's either war or do this. It's either war or do that. It's either JCPOA or war will come after. It's either scale back the maximum pressure or war will come after. We haven't seen war with Iran yet. Is there a risk of conventional war? There is a risk of conventional war. And the reason that Iran and regional actors and the United States are taking these policies and implementing them despite the risk is because these are complex situations, multivariable situations. War is not the ideal outcome, but the risk of war is a manageable risk for many regional actors if the alternative is one where a continuation of hundreds of thousands of dead Syrians in Syria or a failed state in Iraq becomes the norm and the reality. So risking war, unlikely or likely as it may be, and pressuring Iran such that it doesn't have the resources to commit the genocide, ethnic cleansing, etc., is an acceptable risk. In the same vein, Iran, which has a very weak conventional army that is dated and that does not stand up to many armies in the region, shouldn't want and doesn't want conventional war. But it views that escalating in such a way that risks conventional war is an acceptable risk if the reward is a U-turn on maximum pressure that will enable it to get access to the funds that it can use to continue its regional campaign. So there is an acceptance of the risk of conventional war and the calculation of the risk of conventional war on both sides. And that shouldn't, I think, be conflated with accepting war or calling for war. And it's a complex complex situation. We've seen, and it's been documented, what an Iran with a free hand in the region can deliver. There's a huge refugee crisis in Syria that has affected Europe to a large degree, and the United States and the region. There's hundreds of thousands of dead Syrians. There's Iraq that is teetering on the verge of collapse. It's one of the top oil-producing countries in the world that once had the potential to be an economic powerhouse, right now mired with instability, lack of security, and a new generation that's grown up, uneducated and suffering from state failure. So the refraining from taking strong policies that limit Iran's ability to act outside Iran has shown us what happened in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Syria. We know how problematic that is. So I think the calculus for those policymakers is, sure, there is a risk of conventional war. That would be horrible. But if we implement this in the long run, accepting that risk, the ideal scenario is that Iran loses its physical ability and financial ability to continue its regional campaign. So it is a complicated matter. I agree with you 100% that it's a complicated matter. On the second part of your question, you said that Iran has a low-cost regional activity. I think this is one of the biggest myths that's been perpetuated about Iran in policy circles for a very long time. Sure, one militia is cheaper than one arms deal or another that is carried out by one Gulf country or another. But that's just for one militia. You know, when you have over 100 militias, and when you've got you know, weapons that you want to send to these militias, developing ballistic missiles, sending them across oceans in small pieces, sending advisors to militias to assemble these ballistic missiles, paying salaries to militia members that are in direct control of Iran. Maybe the Houthis unpaid salaries, but surely militias in Syria are paid salaries in currency by the Iranian regime. The same can apply to militias that are in Iraq or Hezbollah. You know, one militia might be a very small cost, but 100 or north of 100 militias, that cost starts adding up, and we're talking about billions upon billions of dollars. Iran perfected the art of asymmetric warfare, but it has expanded and spread itself across other sovereign nations so much that the cost is no longer, the cost structure is no longer as we once used to talk about. That Iran spends very little, other countries spend a lot. Iran does spend a lot of money because of the sheer size of its regional proximity.
So I have a number of questions that have been sent to me in the chat and on my email, and that is just, in my view, an indication of how not just intrinsically interesting this issue is, but how informed and provocative you were, that people want to continue this dialogue and ask you many questions. So I know that you're in Dubai, and you've probably just had a very quick opportunity to break your fast before generously joining us on this call. So I want to let you go and consume more in preparation for tomorrow. And just thank you for allowing us to consume intellectually what I think has been a very insightful and informative talk. So if we were all in the same physical space, you would hear a great deal of respectful applause right now. In the absence of that, please let me speak on behalf of everybody who attended this by thanking you, Mohammed, and hoping that we'll have you join us once again in the future to talk about this and many other issues.
Thank you very much, Professor Masoud, and thanks to everybody who asked questions and engaged.
Thank you. All right, thank you everybody for joining us and for such great questions.
Thank you very much.
Okay, bye everybody.
Bye.